I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Jim Willwerth to you. Jim is the staff viticulturist from CCOVI, and he's going to speak to you today on his experience in measuring grapevine winter hardiness. A little bit of background about Jim. He's got a BSc degree from St. Mary's in biology. St. Mary's is Halifax, right?
Yep. Halifax.
Yeah. I don't know, ecum. Yeah. After that, received a certificate in enology and viticulture here at Brock, and then in order to prolong the agony, took a PhD degree with us in my lab, looking at using geomatic technologies to measure soil and vine water status in order to try to measure and figure out the terroir expression of Riesling, which I think he did. So Jim has certainly been very effective in his outreach role here at Brock in the last couple of years. He's made himself very well known in a good way in not only Niagara, but also in Lake Erie North Shore and in Prince Edward County. And so with that, Jim Willwerth.
Thank you, Andy. It's my pleasure to speak to you today. I don't know if they saved the best for last, probably not, but I'm the last speaker today, so hopefully you enjoy the lecture here today. I'm going to speak to you about some of my research I've been doing in the last 3 years concerning grapevine cold hardiness. There are a number of projects ongoing here at the university. We have one of the largest cold hardiness programs probably ongoing right now, and definitely in Canada and in many parts of the world. We're trying to understand the major factors impacting vine cold hardiness. We're trying to have effective outreach technologies to get the information to the growers and to try to mitigate damaging cold temperatures. And we're trying to find new innovative ways to protect grapevines. So I want to give you a bit of an overview today about some of the work that I'm doing and talk to you about some of the different projects I have ongoing both here, but also in some areas like Prince Edward County, where cold hardiness is by far the number one priority there in terms of improving yields and quality and sustainability, which is the ultimate thing. So when we talk about cold hardiness, or cold injury, it's the major contributor to a lot of economic loss in many agriculture sectors, and this is due to poor yields, increased management costs due to cold injury, as well as a decrease in quality. So one of the main research priorities that has been identified in the Ontario grape and wine industry, as well as other industries or other regions, has been cold hardiness. And we've been successful through collaborations between AFC, the Ontario province, the province of Ontario, I should say, Grape Growers of Ontario, and CCOVI, and we've been successful at getting some of these various large grants, which have enabled me to have this position here at the university. So in terms of grapevine cold hardiness, and in terms of the research concerning grapevine cold hardiness, one of the reasons why it's such a big priority now in Ontario, it always has been, but with the increase of Vitis vinifera plantings, this has really become an issue. And Vitis vinifera, as you know, are not very winter hardy, and cold hardiness is the limiting factor for growing many of the cultivars that we do. And as we expand to more areas within Ontario, the climate becomes more and more of a concern. We don't have as much lake effects and mitigations from Lake Ontario, so a lot of these are marginal areas where grapes are now being planted, and so cold hardiness is definitely an important factor. We need to also understand the important factors for our climate, and ultimately what we want to do is optimize cold hardiness for the varieties that we grow and deal with these types of fluctuations that we see during the winter months and also during the periods of acclimation and deacclimation. And we were just talking before this lecture here, about some of these weather fluctuations, and all of a sudden there's a winter storm watch, end of April or middle of April, and now they're calling for a major storm coming through southern Ontario. So I think this is something we're going to have to get used to as years move forward. So in terms of some of the objectives, overall objectives of our cold hardiness research, one is to monitor grapevine cold hardiness and ultimately to create an advanced web-based database, and we've done that through VineAlert, and I'll talk a bit about that at the end of the presentation. We want to further understand how to maximize grapevine cold hardiness and also improve protection methods, and again I'll talk about that in this lecture, and understand some of the key management practices and the most critical factors involved, and ultimately take all of this information at the end of these projects to establish and create a best practices guide for grapevine cold hardiness. So we'll have a working document for the industry from a lot of the findings that we've had from our research. So in terms of freeze injury, it can occur at any time during the dormant period as well as post-bud break. So this can occur during acclimation when vines are gaining cold hardiness, during the midwinter months, at this period of time when the vines are losing cold hardiness, or like I mentioned, during the growing season, especially at the post-bud break in May and so on. And every time we have some type of freeze injury, we're going to have some kind of associated cost with that, whether it's renewing vines, removing trunks and vines, replanting, etc. And this gets very expensive. So we have different types of injury. These are the easy ones to see, where we have obviously some severe bud damage. This was from after the winter of 2010, 2011. So we have the primary buds have been killed, and we're not seeing any growth early in the season here. We can have injury. This was last year after the vines deacclimated very quickly, and this was a Labrusca variety, and you can see the bud was, after it had emerged, got fried. We can have trunk splitting, so damage in the trunks. We can also have what we call silent killers, where it's xylem and phloem damage, and you can't really see that, but you can end up with shoot collapse and so on during the growing season. So there's many different ways we can have freeze injury. In terms of some of the consequences, obviously if we lose primary buds, we're going to lose fruitfulness, or we're going to lose yields because of those loss of buds. We can have uneven or poor vegetative growth, and because of this, we ultimately lose the ability to achieve vine balance. So this results in a loss of uniformity, consistency, quality, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, what we're finding is that we're going to have reductions in yield, quality, and it's going to hurt your pocketbook. So in terms of how you define cold hardiness, it's really the ability of a plant to survive freezing temperature stresses. It's not an easy, it's very complex in terms of how it works in a plant, and there's many contributing factors. But ultimately, it's limited by the plant's genetic potential. So different species and different cultivars have different levels of cold tolerance that they're able to achieve. So like our native vines here, such as Vitis riparia, they're hardy to the negative 40 Celsius around there. Whereas you're looking at the European wine grapes, the Vitis vinifera, and they're more into negative 20 degrees Celsius. And I'll show some data on some of this. It's highly influenced by the environment, and it's a highly dynamic condition. So you can see here that cold hardiness varies throughout the dormant period. We have this period called acclimation, where the plant is gaining cold tolerance. During the coldest months of the season, of the dormant season, we're at maximum cold hardiness. And then as the temperatures start to warm up, the plants start losing cold hardiness, and this is the deacclimation period. So because of these always change, the levels of cold hardiness always change, it's important to monitor these types of things so that we know when proactive measures can be taken. How do we test this? We use a technique called differential thermal analysis. It was actually developed at Harrow and AFC in the 70s. Basically how it works is we go to I'll just go over the method just through these visual pictures here. We basically go out and harvest the canes from the vineyard, from our various trials and so on. We dissect the buds from these canes, which is shown here, We place them on these trays. On these trays we have a thermistor here, which is measuring the temperatures. We have pellet-shaped plates, which we place the buds on. And through all of these connections and a multimeter system here, we're actually able to measure the voltage across these plates and ultimately measure at which temperature these buds are freezing at. We do this through a programmable freezer unit, which mimics a cold event. Temperatures, we drop the temperatures by about 4 degrees an hour till we get to temperatures that we know will be lethal. Below at least -30, -40, we drop the freezer down to. And then ultimately what we could see here is these different exotherms, these releases of energy as water freezes. So here we have the extracellular freezing, which is a non-lethal event. And here are the temperatures at which the buds, the intracellular freezing is occurring for each bud. And you can see these small little peaks, which are our low temperature exotherms, which are indicating when those buds are freezing. So we're able to predict how cold hardy each of these buds are. And through the software program, we're able to calculate all of our LT10, 50, 90s, and so on. Depending on our experiment, we load up the freezers differently in terms of randomizing them and so on and so forth. So here's just a snapshot of different studies concerning cold hardness at the given time here at CCOVI. And some of these I'm involved with, some of these Andy's involved with, and others. So we have our large regional sampling program of bud hardness throughout Ontario. This is Niagara, Prince Edward County, Lake Erie North Shore, looking at assessing different cold hardness of different cultivars at different locations. We have some studies looking at the impacts of crop level and harvest date, and I'll talk a bit about that today. I have a project ongoing right now looking at the use of geotextile materials for a winter protection method, and again, I'll talk about that today as well. Some other studies that are ongoing are the use of plant growth regulators to enhance dormancy and optimize cold hardiness. Some studies looking at natural yields and vine water status and how these are impacting the terroir of winter hardiness. Some different pruning strategies, examination of clone and rootstock effects, and also using some remote sensing to look at vineyard variability and cold hardiness and so on. So in terms of different cultivars, we grow many different cultivars in Ontario. And we've moved from a period of predominantly French hybrids and Nebraska varieties to now more and more vinifera varieties. And just thinking about just VQA-approved varieties, I counted over 32 that we're growing. They're from different groups of origin, so from different vinifera, a lot of variability in terms of the vinifera that we grow. We grow, again, a lot of French hybrids. There's new hybrids with extreme cold hardiness that are now being planted, and just new cultivars in general to our region. And so there's a lot of variation within and between these different categories of vines. So I want to give you a snapshot of just this, at this time, or not this time, but over this past year, just a snapshot of the cold hardiness during maximum winter hardiness or maximum hardiness time. So in terms of just some key cool climate cultivars in Ontario, here's just a snapshot mid-February about the cold hardiness levels of some of our key varieties, such as Riesling, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir. And you can see here, they're hardy to in the -20s. I start seeing some damage to low -20s here. If you think of Bordeaux varieties, here's just a snapshot of the different Bordeaux varieties that we're growing here in Ontario. And you've got some of the more sensitive ones, such as Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc. These ones are not widely planted, Malbec and Petit Verdot. Just to note, those are younger vines, very low crop vines, just to put it into perspective here. So you can see the range of how the Bordeaux varieties can differ just with themselves within that category. Just some interesting vinifera varieties here, from things like Gewürztraminer all the way to Tempranillo, Sangiovese, and so on. You can see they're all pretty similar in terms of their cold hardiness levels, but some of them are more sensitive, such as Semillon and Sangiovese and Tempranillo, where they're not even hardy to -20 for their LT10s. And if you look at something like Sangiovese, the range from the LT10 to the LT90 is quite small. So the Italian varieties can be quite sensitive in terms of their cold hardiness. But in general, the vinifera varieties they're all quite similar really. Just some are slightly more tender than others. Think of Riesling as probably one of the most hardy, and you look at something like Sangiovese or Tempranillo, which are going to be some of your least sensitive, or most sensitive, I should say. Start looking at some other cultivars, such as some varieties like Regent, Bianca, and then some of the cold hardy varieties from Minnesota. And you can see these are going to be a little bit more cold hardy than the vinifera varieties, but something like Frontenac is extremely cold hardy. And this is just the very young vines planted in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And there's documentation that these will be hardier to negative 33 degrees Celsius. So these can be extremely cold hardy varieties. So that's just a quick snapshot of some of the different varieties we've tested, and we're testing over 32 at this given time. So I'm always interested to test new varieties and to see how they will perform under our conditions. So one of the things I want to talk to you a bit about today is some of the studies that we're doing right now in terms of crop level and harvest date. And it can be there's a lot of industry interest in terms of how are crop levels and the timing of harvest, how are they impacting cold hardiness. And there's been some work done, and basically in terms of heavy crop loads, they can enhance the probability and severity of cold injury. And this is really just due to poor acclimation and maturity because of high levels of high crop levels. So in terms of looking at optimal crop levels, they can be quite site-specific as well as cultivar-specific, and cluster thinning, it can improve both hardiness and quality. Basically, the best thing, just like in terms of achieving high quality, is to have this balance between crop and vigor. So again, that whole logic of achieving vine balance. So part of this work is to try to see what are optimal crop levels for increasing and maximizing cold hardiness for some of the key varieties that we grow. And you think about this concept of sources and sinks and crop levels. Basically, your leaf and shoot development at the beginning of the season is the priority, and most of the carbohydrates and so on are going to this new growth. Young roots have priority in late spring, and then when we have fruit on the vine, it becomes more of a sink, and it's more of the priority later in the summer. As the days get shorter and we're near the end of the season, the vine goes into storage mode, and now starch are being deposited in the roots and the trunk. So if you think about just activity during the growing season here, at bud break, basically the vines are using their reserves to produce those first few leaves and so on the vine. And then following that, photosynthesis is driving a lot of driving the photostimulants for the plant, and they're distributed accordingly for flowering, berry development, and ripening, and so on. And part of these, some of these are going for root growth and for storage in terms of starch. Then we move into ripening. A lot of this are going to those sinks in terms of the fruit, and ultimately for dormancy, the plant are storing a lot of these photostimulants and converting them to starch for winter hardiness and to get through dormancy. So in terms of how carbohydrate partitioning and so on can be manipulated through crop levels, basically if you can restrict growth by diverting more energy to the fruit, to fruit development. Conversely, if you remove a lot of fruit, especially early, that'll encourage root development. But too much fruit early in the season will restrict growth and root development. And high crop levels late in the season, the fruit may not mature, and it can also lead to some poor reserves for overwintering success. So really everything is connected here, and this is part of the aspect of looking at crop levels and how it can impact cold hardiness. Timing of harvest may be another factor, especially in a cool climate area like we are in, where we can have short fall periods, and And we grow some later ripening varieties, such as your Bordeaux varieties and so on. So if we have a later harvest, can that delay cold hardiness? That's a question that can be asked. In terms of both the styles of wine that we grow, it also has an impact in terms of the timing of harvest. We have earlier harvest with sparkling production, just a normal harvest with our regular table wines, and then we also have later harvests here as well. And if you think of Riesling, we're having early harvest with Rieslings all the way to a late harvest, such as with either a late harvest wine or ice wine. And as well, we're also making some Apassamento style wines, and with extended hang time. Some of these, like ice wine, some people can crop them very heavy, and this can also be a two-factor aspect here. We're looking at a late harvest plus really heavily cropped vines. So these are some of the things we want to look at. So in terms of the experimental design, basically we're looking at two different cropping levels, a full and half crop, and at different harvest dates, both an earlier harvest and a later harvest. We're looking at, for cultivars, we're looking at Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Franc, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay. Andy's group is also doing some work like this and looking at Pinot Gris as well. And I'm not sure, is there another one, Andy? Pinot Gris?
Riesling, Pinot Gris, Cab Franc, Cab Sauv.
Okay, and Cab Sauv would be the other one to be added to the list. So these are all randomized experiments. The blocks are located both at Vineland as well as in Niagara-on-the-Lake. In terms of our harvest times, we're doing a normal harvest at normal commercial maturity levels, and then another one at least 3 weeks later. Andy's work is also looking at one 6 weeks later. I want to give a couple snapshots in terms of some of the findings from last year, or from 2011. And in terms of Sauvignon Blanc, for example, in 2011, if you recall, it was a wetter, cooler harvest period. And between the differences between the half crop that was picked at a normal time and a full crop at a later period of time, you can see here that there was about 4 degrees difference in terms of cold hardiness during the acclimation period. But later in acclimation, even the half crop had the highest level of cold hardiness, but the other treatments had caught up already. So it was a delay really in acclimation. But ultimately, as you can see here, the vines started to reach about the same levels of hardiness. So you can see here's the full crop with the late harvest, and after it was harvested, it did catch up in terms of acclimation. And by the end, we're looking in mid-winter months, they were all at the same maximum hardiness levels. But during the acclimation period, there were some differences here. So it seemed that both crop level and harvest date had some impacts during the acclimation. Flip to this year, no differences. Sauvignon Blanc, it matured very early, and by the time we started actually testing, they had already been basically all the same levels. So big vintage effect there. And if you look at the maturity levels of the fruit, which I'll show, the maturity levels were also quite high. Look at something like Pinot Noir, which can be sensitive to yields and so on. In last year, or 2011, I should say, you can see here again the full crop were less hardy during acclimation. But again, after a harvest, after both harvests, the early and the late harvest, again, pretty tight in terms of their cold hardiness. And they didn't vary after that either. The only differences were during early and acclimation. In terms of flipping to this past year, more separation for all the different treatments. So you could see here that the full crop vines were less cold hardy earlier in acclimation, and they didn't acclimate as well either. You can see here the half crop that was harvested early was lower and deeper in terms of its cold tolerance, by over 2 degrees Celsius, and even up to this stage, you can see here that it is more cold hardy, and the ones that were picked, or the ones that have heavier crop loads, are slightly less cold tolerant. Generally speaking, you'll find a lot of these, from most of the work that I've done, you see similar rates, and that's all driven by temperature. So if you can get the vines deeper, they will generally remain more cold hardy throughout the period. But in terms of the actual deacclimation rates, since it's driven so much by temperature, you see that they usually have similar rates of deacclimation. They may vary though in terms of their actual cold hardiness. Something like Riesling last year, no differences. Very, very small differences in terms of response to both crop level and harvest date. This year though, again, earlier during acclimation, the full crop vines were less hardy and they did not acclimate as well either. In terms of, they acclimated, but they did not reach the same level of cold tolerance that some of the half crop vines did. In Chardonnay, this surprised me quite a bit actually. We did not collect any data on Chardonnay 2 years ago because we got froze out at Vineland for Chardonnay, and we didn't have much of a crop there. So in terms of last year, you can see here the full crop that was harvested late was much less cold hardy throughout the whole period, and not until February did it reach similar levels. And now they're about the same. But during acclimation and the midwinter months, crop levels seem to have an impact for this particular vintage, at least for Chardonnay. I want to have one slide from some of the fruit composition from this past year, and this is only showing fruit composition for crop levels at the first harvest. You can see for the white varieties especially that crop levels seem to have a big impact. And when I talk about levels of maturity, yeah, Sauvignon Blanc was really ripe when we first picked it. 23.6 for full crop, half crop 25, and that was before the winery had actually harvested the vines. So that was about 2 degree or about a brick and a half difference there. Riesling about a brick difference in terms of the half crop compared to the full crop. Chardonnay, again, just over a brick difference as well. And when you're looking at acidity levels, they were about a gram different as well for each different, for between half and full crop. Pinot Noir, not much difference at all. Very low yields though. I'd like to get the yields higher, but again, we can only do what the vines allowed us for this past year. And what surprised me as well was Cab Franc was, again, with the cluster thinning and reducing the crop and the yields by about half, no really difference in terms of the bricks, which surprised me for reds. Both the reds really surprised me for this, especially for this past year. So in terms of just some general summaries and some results, is that it seems that crop level does appear to have some effects on cold hardiness dynamics. And it seems to have more an impact in terms of the acclimation period, but also there are some impacts mid to late winter. And this is in agreement with some of the research that's already been done in terms of crop levels. It doesn't seem to have generally as much of an impact midwinter, but it can delay acclimation. Harvest date, again, had less of an impact, but an earlier harvest can lead to a quicker acclimation, it appears, especially from last year. For some varieties in Sauvignon Blanc from 2 years ago. There's always this concept of early to bed, early to rise, and that the treatments that don't acclimate earlier or didn't get as cold hardy, they seem to deacclimate first and are less or can be less cold tolerant later in the season. But vintage differences were quite strong, especially with some of the early harvests that occurred in 2012. In terms of some of the crop control, crop thinning obviously can impact yields and as well as fruit quality. I think that's pretty well set in stone in terms of the research that's been done. There's been so much research in terms of crop thinning, in terms of how it impacts yields and quality. In terms of the later harvests, I didn't put any actual data up, but they were associated with higher soluble solids, lower acidity, and higher pH. This is interesting in terms of some of the work that's going to come out of the Reynolds lab, looking at some of the extended hang time trials and looking at some of the specific aroma compounds and phenolic compounds and so on with these later harvests. That part could be kind of interesting. In terms of varietal responses, each variety seemed to respond differently in terms of crop level and especially with cold hardiness, but also fruit composition as well. And in some years, it seemed to be impacted more than others. And what I was surprised with was the response with Pinot Noir for cold tolerance, even with those small yield differences and small yields to begin with. But again, I'd like to get higher crop levels, hopefully this year if we're lucky, and then see if we get greater distinction between the two crop levels, if that can have a greater impact. Another aspect I want to talk about, and this has been a project that has evolved in the last couple of years, especially with my trips to Prince Edward County, to Quebec, and so on, is looking at the use of different protection strategies where wind machines may or probably will not work because the temperatures are so extreme during the midwinter months that even by raising the temperatures by a couple degrees, it will not have an impact. And here's just an example of the need for some protection if you're growing vinifera varieties especially. This is data taken from this past year in Prince Edward County. These are our LT values, LT 10, 50, and 90. And you can see during the fall period, there's no threats to any injury or what have you, but then you get these daggers going right through the LT data, and it's not only one event, which is catastrophic at times, but it's multiple events that are occurring throughout the dormant period. And when you see these types of things, you have to have some type of further protection. And in the county, for example, they're burying vines. So, and in Quebec as well, they bury vines with the soil. So they lay the canes down, the fruiting canes, they select them in the fall, lay them on a low wire, and then they actually bury the vines. So that's the way to protect them during the winter months. It's very laborious, it's very expensive, and you get a lot of loss in terms of just physical damage. So came up to thought about this experiment using geotextile materials. They're used in the nursery business, they're used for winter protection of crops, and specifically they're used a lot in the Quebec vineyards. So the use of these has increased quite a bit in Ontario as of late. And this is looking at areas where vinifera are planted, again, like I mentioned, more marginal areas, which are non-traditional grape growing areas, especially for vinifera vines, which are cold sensitive. But also, they could be used for growing really cold sensitive varieties, even here in Niagara, if warranted. So why are some of the concerns with burying vines? Concerned with moving a lot of soil around and damaging soils, damaging buds. It's hard. It's a very difficult process of trying to bury a plant and not injure it at all physically. The whole issue of bud rot and loss, especially when you have that rain out there like that. Ultimately, because of both bud loss due to rot, due to physical damage, and so on, poor yields are always a concern. And also the other factor is timing of burying and the weather. Both burying and unearthing is a problem because the soil conditions have to be right. If you have thaws in the winter and you get rains like that, it literally washes the soil off the vines and you lose all that protection. So by having the flexibility of using a material like this, it may be advantageous. Just some work looking at burying vines. This was work done at Cornell. Martin Goffney and others did this work. After we all know about the severe winter of 04-05, they decided to bury some vines of Gewurz, Pinot Gris, and Cabernet. And what they found was that the aerial canes proved to be more cold hardy than the buried ones. And we'll talk a bit about some of my findings here. And that also buried canes experienced the late shoot development once they were unburied. And ultimately, they found that in the years that they did in 06, it didn't warrant burying the vines because the temperatures were relatively mild. So, in terms of the evolution of this research, I explained a bit about why we decided to start doing a study looking at these materials. And some of the research questions were, well, do these work? Can they mitigate damaging cold temperatures in the areas where we're growing vines? Do these materials cause some type of greenhouse effect? So, are they warming the temperatures around the vine during periods where you don't want them to, and ultimately decreasing their cold hardiness, which is the final thing we want to look at, is what's the impact on cold hardiness dynamics in bud survival. And ultimately use this to try to help determine best practices in terms of when to put this on, when to take these off, and have the same kind of advice for burying of vines as well. So we did this work for the first year in the county, and it was in conjunction with the project with Margaret Appleby. She actually had some of this material, and so we decided to do a small trial to see what we find. So in terms of Geotextile experiment one, this was done a couple of years ago. We basically put this different material randomly throughout the vineyard block, looking at one where we actually laid the textile on top of the canes on the low wire, and the other system, what we did was we basically spur pruned the vines and then just tented the material over top the spur pruned vines. So we had basically a cane prune system and a spur prune system. We put data loggers under the geotextile, as well as had in all of our vineyards that we use for research. We also have data loggers within the vineyard itself to measure just the vineyard temperature. And then we measured the buds, sampled the buds under the materials for cold hardiness. So this is a busy graph, but I just wanted to put one graph up that basically shows what they did. If you look at, if you look at the midwinter period of January 2012, we can see that we had temperatures that reached in the vineyard reached about -25. In terms of the textile materials underneath the geotextiles, it reached about -15 degrees Celsius. Similarly here, when the vineyard temperatures reached about -20, it was about -9 underneath the geotextile materials. But if you recall, last year we had that crazy abnormal warm weather in March, and you could see the temperatures were rising up to about 30 degrees Celsius underneath the materials. So we're getting some of a greenhouse effect there. And ultimately, the grower cooperator pulled all the material off. So we didn't get any data after that because there was a lot of concern over the temperatures reaching underneath the material there, which is warranted. We know what happened last year in terms of deacclimation, and I'll show a graph about that later from last year. But how did this impact cold hardiness using these materials? You can see in most periods of time there weren't many differences. Max hardiness, though, was impacted a bit by the use of the geotextiles. For the LT10 values, we're about 4 degrees less cold hardy using geotextiles, and not as large of a difference in terms of the 50, which is only about a half a degree or so. But during the deacclimation period, prior to removing that material, there were no differences, which was interesting. So it had an impact. It worked well in terms of mitigating the cold temperatures, and it didn't seem to have too much of an impact in terms of reducing cold hardness too much, to a point where it was a critical issue. So like I mentioned, the materials were removed mid-March, and the vines were unearthed shortly after. And as you recall, last year we had cold temperatures at the end of April, which killed a lot of primary buds, not so much here in Niagara, but in the county. The vines had deacclimated more, partly due to the fact they were buried. And when they were unearthed, they had compromised cold hardiness, and there was an injury occurred on a lot of primary buds. There's also some cold events that occurred in May as well. But what was the interesting thing was at harvest this year, from the flagged panels, it was observed that about 100% crop was found in the Chardonnay. The other areas where the vines were buried only had about 20 to 30% yield. So this was a very interesting find. And from there, we decided, let's try to pursue this for another year and expand on this project. So this is the expanded study from this past year, which is still ongoing. And this time around, we're looking at 2 different types of materials. One was the same one we used last year with this white polyester felt, and another one is a polyester felt with like a black plastic below it. Looking at 2 different timings of removal as well, with one at the beginning of deacclimation. So these materials actually came off at the end of March this year, and then the later removal, which will be near the end of deacclimation, later in April, and those materials are still on the vines. So what we're doing is we're comparing these different materials to buried vines as well as the control vines, so the vines that are just exposed to all the cold temperatures. Two different locations of the study. One is at the same vineyard site in Prince Edward County. The other one is in Vineland here in Niagara. And looking at two cultivars this time, both Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And again, we're monitoring the temperatures using data loggers, both hobo loggers as well as what they're called eye buttons, and they're tiny little, small little data loggers you can attach to vines and any type of surface and so on. So we're using these two different types of monitoring systems. So in terms of some of the materials, this is when we were first laying the material down. This is the white polyester felt material, and this is the one with the black plastic coating. They're much different in terms of working with them and so on as well. You can see this one likes to lay a lot nicer than this type of material. What we did was we tied the canes below the material, so we selected our canes. This is at a commercial vineyard, and you can see the canes laid down and tied to the wire already. For what we did was I laid down a bunch of different canes because during the dormant season I was going to sample them throughout every couple of weeks, so we left a lot more for sampling, but done the same way. We laid them down on the lower wires and then put the material on over top. So this is how it looks out in Vineland. We use larger materials, and it's draped over the third wire. In this case, it's draped either over the second wire. This is at a commercial vineyard where I'm doing some temperature monitoring, or it's laid at the. And these are these are cane pruned, and the other block they're laid closer to the ground. So what are some of the differences that we're finding in terms of temperature? Not a heck of a lot of differences during the early acclimation in November. This is when we put them on in mid-November, and this is from the last 2 weeks of the month. Obviously, soils, if you look, have the strongest mitigation effects, if you want to say that, in terms of the differences between what's the ambient temperatures are and what the temperatures are under the ground. During the December months, again, the minimum temperature, the absolute was -11. Under the materials was about half that, and on the soils about a quarter of that. Midwinter, January, there was no snow on the ground at this period of time. I want to make that point because it's an important point. When there's no snow on the ground, the minimum temperatures reached one night with -23. Under the two materials, about -19. At that given time, the vines were hardy to about -23, so we didn't see any damage from these events. Under the soil, though, about half that, about -10 were the temperatures underneath the soils. And if you look at some types of greenhouse effects and so on, there's not a lot that you're really seeing in terms of these different materials. Now, how does this change, or what impact do we have for cold hardiness under these same given periods of time? During the acclimation period, there was some reduced cold hardiness with Chardonnay only. For some reason, it didn't acclimate as well. But midwinter, in some of these trials, are actually more cold hardy underneath the materials. And not much difference with the other material compared to the control vines. So these control vines are not the buried vines, but these are the ones that are exposed on the normal fruiting wires and so on. So they're exposed to all the ambient temperature. Now, how does this change as we move forward? This is now February, when we've had some snow cover on the ground. Another cold event of -25. So that's like deadly in terms of reaching those types of temperatures with vinifera vines. You look at the one type of material, -17. The other one, about -14. In the soil, again, very good in terms of insulating. And again, all of these are protected at this temperature. In terms of March, again, some mitigation in terms of cold temperatures, but not as much. And again, this is a period now where things are warming up. The soils are a bit warmer, and we're seeing that these materials aren't working as well during this period of time. But again, these temperatures are not critical at this period of time either, at least the ones that were reached. So here's just an example. I pulled up a graph looking at all the daily temperature data. Actually, this is more than daily. This is every half an hour in terms of data. And you can see during the periods of snow cover, there's not as much bounce in the data. Yeah, there's some when we have some real temperature, cold events, and so on. But if you look here at this period of time now that we're warming up, you can see temperatures are reaching up to around 20 degrees, getting close to that, and the temperatures are a lot higher in terms of what their minimum temperatures are. So there's just an example of the in row, and you can see where the vines are buried, and they're totally exposed. And you look here with the geotextile materials, there's a lot more snow cover, and in some cases, there's still snow over top of this material, which adds another layer of protection. So you can argue that we have data to show this, and we will have data to maybe show this in the next couple of weeks when we start unearthing vines and we start looking at temperature data under the soil. But you can start to see some influences of these warming effects of these materials now as we're getting warmer temperatures. And the materials that have been removed are less cold hardy than, the treatments that still have the material on are less cold, the vines are less cold hardy underneath those materials than they are for the ones that have been removed about 3 weeks ago. So we're starting to lose some cold hardiness there due to the greenhouse effects, if you want to say that. So that's a really important factor in terms of what's happening now below the ground. Because below the ground, the temperatures are consistently warmer, nothing even below zero at this period of time in the last month or the last 3 weeks or so, and temperatures have reached about 15 degrees. So what's happening below the ground? And I'm assuming that they're going to be less cold tolerant than the vines that are even under the materials right now. So the next round of sampling will be the end of next week or so, and we will start unearthing the vines and start actually testing the cold hardiness of those different vines. And what we're going to do is we're going to follow this right through bud break and so on, and to see what the effects are. And the other thing is looking at I'd like to do a survey of the county region and actually see what percent of viable buds are there to start with after unbearing vines, not just due to cold injury potentially, but due to physical damage. What's the starting number of viable buds? Right now, from some of the sampling we've done under the textiles, they're about 100%. Above the ground, less than 40%, as low as 10% right now in terms of viable buds. So the geotextiles are working in terms of moderating minimum temperatures. The canes and the buds look a heck of a lot better than the ones under the ground. So in some places where the soils have washed away, the canes and the buds do not look as healthy. The snow cover does have a huge moderation effect, and if you can keep the snow on the ground for a longer period of time, it's very advantageous. So that's a good factor, a good result that we've seen with these materials. And sometimes the materials can actually improve the cold hardiness at certain times. And there are some impacts of mid-winter hardiness levels at times as well. Some other observations and thoughts here. One is the greenhouse effect, especially when the soils warm up. We're seeing more of these types of greenhouse effects. This is going to have a big implication in terms of the timing and removal of these. So if you remove too early or too late, there's a lot of implications there. And then this is the other factor, right? The big factor is the logistics of this and the economics. In terms of the cost of this material and how durable it is. If it's not durable, it's not going to be economical to use. And another factor that I've seen, and this is only in some areas, and interestingly enough, it was in the vines that were tented here in Vineland, is this: rodents. So in Quebec, they use straw in these geotextile materials, and I've seen some growers where they've used rat poison underneath the vines, underneath the material. So in this, they seem to like the Riesling. We actually I'm doing a small trial there with Riesling, using even more different types of materials, and this is what we found.
and it's not pretty at all. Like the bud's eaten away. I mean, it's destroyed. So this is the latest on this geotextile trial, and it's pretty exciting. I think it has a lot of warrants. It can be. I think it's very. It can really be used to improve protection of vines, and it's a little bit more practical too than bearing. So it's just the cost and logistics, but there's ways of putting this material on efficiently. That's for sure. There's better ways to do it than what we had to do it, but for research purposes. We were dragging it out there and putting it on the panels and so on. It was time consuming and a pain, but if you have the right setup, it wouldn't be as difficult. So I'm interested to see what we're going to find this year during deacclimation and bud break and so on. And finally, I just wanted to update everyone in terms of the current state of how we are in terms of cold hardiness and how we're looking at this period of time. And if you think about last year, we had an exceptional growing season. We had early harvests on everything, and peridot information was fantastic. The wood hardened off really, really well, especially earlier on in the season. And vines acclimated at an average rate and similar to 2010. The growing season was similar to 2010, so it's not surprising that the vine acclimation was similar. We did have some fluctuations during the winter months, and during January and February, we actually had periods where it went up to 15 degrees Celsius, and then a couple days later, dropped down to negative 15. And so there was some concerns there that we may have some deacclimation, and we had some slight, but we actually had a little bit of reacclimation for some varieties too, which was interesting to see. And then we had some cold events. Wind machines were run at some periods of time, late January, early February, and this is, again, when there's a lot of ice wine harvests going on later in January as well, which was good that we were able to get all of our ice wine off and not sustain any damage. So our bud survival rates right now are good for most regions. There are colder, I would say more normal spring, especially compared to last year, has resulted in a slower deacclimation, but I don't think anyone's going to complain about that compared to last year. And our vines now are just starting to lose tolerance at a faster rate. So as of today, our vines the vine tolerance is within negative 10 is the most sensitive cultivar. Chardonnay, I think at Beamsville Bench, I think that was negative 10.5. Just the data was posted today, and what most varieties are between the negative 10 to negative 16 range. So all this data again is posted on the Vine Alert webpage, and this is our advanced cold hardiness database and alerting system. And we use this a lot in the alerting system through periods of risk. And at this time last year, we were sending almost weekly alerts. When we first found that the vines had lost about 10 degrees, 15 degrees of cold hardiness in a matter of 2 weeks, we posted a lot of different alerts to inform the industry. And the grape industry ultimately made out pretty good last year, all things considered. A lot better than some of the other tender fruit and so on, fortunately. And here's just an example of cold hardiness dynamics over the last 5 years. Or last 4 years, sorry. You can see this is where we are right now. And if you look at that, it's pretty similar to 2010, 2011 in terms of where we actually were even more cold tolerant at this period of time than we were then. But if you look at it compared to last year, we're a good 10 degrees more cold tolerant than we were at this time last year. So this is how fast we deacclimated last March and how we ended up. When I gave the talk last year, we were around right here in terms of the cold hardiness level. And that's ultimately how we ended up. So you can see how each year we have different rates of acclimation. Generally, the wetter, poorer years are like 2009. We didn't acclimate as well, didn't reach as much maximum cold tolerance, and we deacclimated a bit quicker. And in 2010, we were quite deep in terms of cold hardiness. This past year, we weren't as cold tolerant as we were in other years. But because of the cold spring, we're deacclimating at a slower rate, but that's going to increase now that we're going to get warmer weather. In terms of different varieties, this is just a different response of the different cultivars at a sampling location. And you can see here the more tender ones are Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc, for example. And at a period at the end of January, beginning of February, we had some temperatures that dipped down where we just hit the LT10 values for both Syrah and Merlot and you can see from our bud sampling data, the numbers dropped a bit in terms of about 72% and 89% respectively for Syrah and Merlot. But again, still pretty good shape. Most varieties are at least 80% survival rate, 80-90% across the regions. In terms of just some conclusions, there's so much I could talk about. It's not even funny, but I just wanted to showcase some of the stuff today. In terms of just final thoughts here, cold injury is going to always be a major threat to agriculture, and it's not just here in Ontario. It's all across Canada. It's through many parts of the U.S. Right now, bud break is occurring in California and other places, so now they're concerned about frost already there. So there's always that risk of frost and midwinter damage and so on. So to understanding how to get the vines to be optimized in terms of cold hardiness and to find the best winter protection methods possible, especially where we're going to be growing grapes in marginal areas, it's really important that we understand how to optimize the vines to the best shape they can be in. And this is really critical in terms of vine balance, uniformity, consistency, and ultimately quality. If you start with a vineyard block where you have a lot of variation in that block, you can't have a consistent vineyard, consistent quality. That's not good. We have to make sure we have everything as consistent as possible, and it all starts with the spring and after winter and getting through the winter. I just wanted to put this up because I thought about this one night actually. I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought about Andy's view of vineyard factors impacting wine quality. And you think about climate and our viticultural practices, obviously the terroir factors in terms of site and so on, and how all of these are interrelated and how they impact vigor and yield, canopy, microclimate, and so on. And ultimately, what this does is affect not only fruit composition and quality, but also vineyard practices and so on, how they impact insight and so on, how they impact winter hardiness and survival. And basically, this ends up being a feedback loop back to the beginning. Because if you start with compromised vines at the beginning of the year, and you move up to the top here, wait a second, we have to change all of these again, and these are all going to impact vigor and yield and so on and so forth. And again, all the way down to your yields and your quality. So it's just something I just wanted to throw in there. I thought it was just an interesting concept here about what we can do here to make sure that we have our optimal hardiness and best bud survival possible. So in terms of a general conclusion, when we're pushing boundaries and so on to be successful, research as well as experimentation within your own vineyards and so on is key. Effective outreach and innovation is key to success in terms of, again, pushing our boundaries, improving our quality and our profits. And looking forward, we're going to have to continue to be innovative and continue to be concerned about these types of things such as weather extremes, water is becoming an issue, and so on and so forth. And at one point, people thought wind machines would not help so much, or before wind machines existed, what would we do? And so what's next? It's a question I ask always. Because humans are very innovative. We can always find solutions to problems. So to conclude here, I just wanted to put, just in terms of some facts, in terms of cold hardness testing. Right now we've got over 9 projects, over 32 varieties we've tested at over 16 locations. This is using 3 freezer units. So far to date, we've tested 71,400 buds. And just this year alone, we've increased our capacities, and so just this year alone, 38,000 buds. So that's a lot of data that we've collected, and in the future, we're hoping to use this data to not only look at cultural practices and winter protection strategies, but also look at cold hardness modeling and collaborating with other institutions on looking at how cold hardness is going to look in the future and what varieties we can be growing and so on and so forth. So there's just a lot of opportunities when you collect this much data. So I'd like to acknowledge all the different funding agencies and collaborators, all the assistance of all these people, and thank you for your attention.
Does anyone have any questions?
We have a question from online today. One of our viewers is asking, one second, just here. How can we detect or increase the response to the cold in plants?
How can we increase the response
Yes.
in plants? It's one thing we're trying to study in terms of crop levels and so on. The vines they're going to respond to the environmental conditions, shorter growing period, shorter day lengths, temperatures, and so on. That's what drives the plant to start acclimating. And depending on the environmental conditions, it's ultimately what determines how fast they acclimate and so on. But we're looking at some vineyard management practices to help improve the acclimation rates and so on, maximum hardiness.
Okay, we have another question from online. When grower has noticed sap flowing, what are the critical temperatures at this point of deacclimation, and will below zero temperatures result in trunk damage at this stage?
No. It's right now the vines are tolerant to, like I said, negative 10 degrees. We will not see, just because the temperatures will drop below zero, you're not going to sustain trunk damage. You need long, cold, persistent temperatures to get trunk damage, or very cold temperatures to achieve that. What you're seeing right now, I wouldn't be concerned with.
I was curious, how much of this Geotextiles right now? Do you have a figure of any kind?
In terms of the cost?
Yeah. Like per square foot or whatever. Selling it.
Yeah, I forget what I paid. I meant to write that down before. In terms of the cost, they're not cheap. One season, 2 seasons, like you need multiple years of use to pay for them. Each one varies for the cost. I can get the information for you, but yeah, they're not cheap.
You spoke about the need to remove the geotextiles early enough this season, and I understand that you're talking about deacclimation. What about bud development? If the ground is still cold, would there be significant bud development? For example, if you were to apply the geotextiles, say in 1st of May, and leave them on there until somewhere past the last frost period, would we be able to gain a few weeks out of that? Or is the cold ground still going to hold back?
Yeah, the question was if leaving the materials on after, we're putting them on around May when the ground is still cold, and then to help reduce frost damage. In Quebec, what they do is they loosen them off, the textiles, like they're all secured, and they actually just loosen them and let them flap in the wind, and they leave them on well past any risk of frost. So they do have some frost protection.
Do you feel that it can advance the buds further then?
It probably will, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Some of the materials, which is interesting, especially one with the black plastic coating, I think it can actually retain some of the colder temperature of the soil and not allow the soil to warm up as much. Like it seems to, underneath that material, it seems to hold the temperatures better. Either if it gets really warm, it'll stay warmer, but if it's cooler, it seems to be cooler under the material. Like when you go and sample, you put your hand underneath, and it can be quite cool underneath the material. So like it may actually delay bud break if we would leave it on. I don't know. That's one thing I want to look at. Last year they were removed too early, but this year the one treatment we want to leave them on for an extended period of time just to see what happens. Because I was a little bit surprised in terms of some of the materials being more cold tolerant underneath the material, even in midwinter, which was interesting. Yes?
Is there any way of predicting cold hardness by looking at temperatures only?
Any way of predicting cold hardiness by looking at temperatures only? There are some models that are developed and being developed where you can put temperature data in based on min, max, and so on, and have for certain varieties be able to predict roughly how cold hardy those plants would be. So that's where we're getting at in terms of continuing to
look at the model. It's the Ferguson model out of Washington State University, and see how that model fits for our climate with the data that we have. So that's really the key, is and then look how is not only from the temperature of experience how cold are they are, but based on climate models in terms of 30 years from now, what's cold hardness, what are cold hardness dynamics going to look like? Any other questions? Thank you for your attention.
And Jim, that's just a little token of our appreciation. We have a book for you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.